On August 2nd, 1985, Delta Flight 191 took off from Fort Lauderdale Hollywood International Airport, heading for Dallas. Mark Stevens, age 25, was one of the passengers on this seemingly routine flight. As a business traveler, he was used to the humdrum of airports and airplanes, but this trip would be far from ordinary. The day started off clear and bright. Mark settled into his window seat, ready for a few days of meetings in Dallas. The usual mix of passengers filled the plane: families, business people, and solo travelers like himself. The flight attendants moved gracefully through the cabin, assisting with luggage and offering pre-flight snacks and drinks. Mark accepted a cup of coffee, thanking the attendant with a nod. He sipped his drink, gazing out the window at the ground crew finishing their tasks. The engines roared to life, and soon they were speeding down the runway. The familiar rush of takeoff pressed him back into his seat as the plane lifted off. The takeoff was smooth, and Mark watched the city shrink below him. The buildings turned into tiny specks, and the landscape transformed into a patchwork of fields and roads. He leaned back in his seat, letting out a contented sigh. The initial thrill of flying always faded quickly for him, and he settled in for the flight. He pulled out a book, intending to pass the time with some light reading. Just before the final descent into Dallas, Mark noticed something odd in the clouds. At first, it was just a flicker at the corner of his eye, a fleeting shadow that seemed out of place. He blinked and looked again, but there was nothing unusual. Shaking his head, he returned to his book, telling himself it was just his imagination. The steady drone of the engines and the calm, dimly lit cabin created a tranquil environment, perfect for reading. However, the peace was short-lived. The flicker returned, this time more persistent and harder to ignore. He put the book down and focused his gaze outside the window, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Shadowy figures seemed to be keeping pace with the plane, darting in and out of the clouds with unnatural movements. He rubbed his eyes, thinking he might be tired, but no matter how much he tried to dismiss it, the figures were still there. Curiosity quickly turned into unease. These weren't just shadows. They had a form, a presence that felt disturbingly real. The way they moved, with an eerie fluidity, didn't make sense. Clouds don't move like that, he thought. He looked around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had noticed, but the passengers seemed oblivious, engrossed in their books or conversations. A chill ran down his spine, and he tried to stay calm, convincing himself it was just a trick of the light or an unusual weather phenomenon. The pilot's voice crackled over the intercom, bringing him back to the present. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking. We're experiencing some unexpected weather conditions. Please remain seated with your seatbelts fastened, and we'll be on the ground within 10 minutes. His tone was calm, but there was an undertone of concern that made Mark's heart beat a little faster. He looked back out the window. The shadows were still there, more distinct than ever. Passengers around him began to shift in their seats, exchanging worried glances. The flight attendants moved swiftly, ensuring everyone was buckled in and reassuring them with practiced smiles. The plane started to shake, a gentle tremor at first, then more violently. The shadows outside seemed to respond, moving closer, almost as if they were the ones shaking the plane. Mark's heart pounded in his chest, and he gripped the armrests tightly. The shaking grew worse, and the cabin filled with the sounds of nervous murmurs and a few muffled cries. The overhead bins rattled, and the lights flickered. He glanced out the window once more and felt his blood run cold. One of the shadowy figures was right there, pressed against the glass, staring at him with an empty gaze. It was like looking into the eyes of something not of this world. His breath caught in his throat, and he couldn't tear his eyes away. The engines roared, struggling against whatever force was acting upon them. Suddenly, there was a loud bang, and the plane violently dropped downwards. It felt like a roller coaster. The lights flickered again, and the cabin was plunged into darkness for a moment before the emergency lights kicked in. Panic among the passengers grew, with cries and prayers filling the plane. The flight attendants were doing their best to maintain order, but fear is contagious. The shaking intensified, turning into violent turbulence that tossed them around in their seats. Mark glanced around, seeing wide eyes and white knuckles gripping armrests. His own heart felt like it might burst from his chest. The shadowy figure outside the window was still there, its hollow eyes locked onto his. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was somehow causing this, feeding off their fear. Amidst the chaos, one of the flight attendants managed to make her way to his row. "Sir, please stay calm," she said, her voice steady but her eyes betraying her own fear. "We're doing everything we can to stabilize the situation." He nodded numbly, unable to find his voice. She moved on, trying to reassure the others. Another loud bang echoed through the cabin and the plane tilted sharply. His stomach lurched and he heard people screaming. The emergency oxygen masks dropped from the overhead compartments and he fumbled to put his on, his hands shaking uncontrollably. The figure outside seemed to mock him, its expression unchanged. Through the small window, he could see the other shadowy figures converging, merging into one large, ominous entity. The sensation of being watched, hunted, grew stronger. He could almost feel its cold breath on his neck. The engines made a horrific grinding noise, and the plane began to descend rapidly. The pilot's voice came over the intercom again, this time more urgent. "Brace for impact! Brace for impact!" The cabin erupted into chaos, with passengers screaming, crying, and praying. Mark leaned forward, clutching his knees, trying to brace himself as best he could. The plane shuddered violently, and he felt the pressure in his ears increase. The descent seemed to last forever, every second stretching into an eternity of fear. The ground rushed up to meet them, and he knew there was nothing he could do but wait for the inevitable impact. The shadowy entity outside tightened its grip around the plane, almost as if it was guiding them to their death. They hit the ground with a force that felt like being slammed into a brick wall. The sound of metal tearing and glass shattering filled his ears. His body was thrown forward, and the seatbelt bit into his abdomen, knocking the wind out of him. His head struck the seat in front of him, and everything went black. When he came to, all he heard were screams, cries, and the distant wail of sirens. He was disoriented, his vision blurry, and every part of his body ached. He could see rescue teams moving through the debris, pulling survivors from the twisted metal that had once been a plane. He was in shock, his mind struggling to process what had just happened. The memories of the shadowy figures haunted him, their hollow eyes and sinister presence etched into his mind. As he was lifted onto a stretcher and carried away from the wreckage, he couldn't shake the feeling that they were still watching, still lurking just out of sight. In the hospital, he told the nurses and doctors what he saw. They listened with sympathetic smiles, but clearly thought it was the trauma talking. They attributed his visions to the stress of the crash and the injuries he had sustained. But Mark knew what he had seen. Those figures were real, and they were responsible for the crash. The investigators came and he told them everything he saw. They looked skeptical, but he insisted it was real. They found no mechanical failure to explain the crash, and his story about what he saw was dismissed as a hallucination caused by stress. Mark started having nightmares and flashbacks. Those figures haunted him every night. Most people didn't believe him. Friends and family tried to be supportive but couldn't understand. He went to therapists and support groups, but nothing seemed to help. The memory of those things, whatever they were, was always there. He still didn't know what he saw that day, but he knew it was real. They were there, and they caused the plane to crash. Months passed, but the nightmares never subsided. Mark found himself increasingly isolated, his life unraveling in the shadow of the crash. His once promising career was in shambles, and his relationships strained to the breaking point. He moved through life like a ghost, haunted by the hollow-eyed figures that had caused the disaster. The world outside seemed indifferent to his suffering. The media moved on, the story of Delta Flight 191 fading into the background as new events took the spotlight. The official explanation of a microburst causing the crash was accepted without question, and Mark's insistence on the presence of the shadowy entities was dismissed as the ravings of a traumatized mind. One night as he lay in bed, Mark felt an overwhelming sense of dread. He turned to look at his window, half expecting to see the figures staring back at him. Instead, he saw nothing but the darkness of the night. Trying to shake off the feeling, he turned over and forced himself to sleep. His dreams, as always, were filled with the same horrific images. He was back on the plane, watching the shadowy figures as they pressed against the windows. The sensation of being watched, the cold breath on his neck, and the malevolent eyes followed him even into the depths of his subconscious. But this time, there was something different. Amidst the chaos and fear, he saw a face. A woman's face, serene and sad, her eyes pleading for something. Mark awoke with a start, drenched in sweat, the image of the woman's face etched into his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that she was trying to tell him something, to warn him. He sat up in bed, his heart racing, and decided he had to find out more. There was something about her that felt different from the other shadowy figures, almost as if she was on his side. Determined to uncover the truth, Mark began to dig deeper into the events leading up to the crash. He spent hours at the library, poring over old newspapers and flight records. He contacted other survivors, hoping someone else might have seen what he did. Most were reluctant to talk, and those who did had no recollection of anything unusual. The consensus was the same: trauma-induced hallucinations. One evening, Mark received a call from an unfamiliar number. The voice on the other end was soft and hesitant. "Mr. Stevens, my name is Sarah. I was on Flight 191 too. I think we need to talk." They agreed to meet at a quiet cafe. Sarah was a petite woman with a haunted look in her eyes, much like Mark's. As they sat down, she glanced around nervously before speaking. "I've been having nightmares too. Every night I see those figures. And the woman." Mark's heart skipped a beat. "You saw her too? The one with the sad eyes?" Sarah nodded, her hands trembling. "Yes, I think she's trying to tell us something. I did some research and found out that there was a similar crash in 1965, Flight 407. The circumstances were eerily similar: clear skies, sudden turbulence, unexplained mechanical failure, and there were reports of shadowy figures seen by the passengers before the crash." Mark listened intently, his mind racing. "Why didn't anyone mention this before?" "It was covered up," Sarah replied. "Back then, people were more willing to dismiss supernatural explanations. The official report blamed a microburst, just like our flight. But I found an old diary from one of the survivors. She described the same figures, the same feelings of being watched." Mark felt a chill run down his spine. "What do we do now?" Sarah looked him in the eye, her expression resolute. "We need to find out who that woman is. I think she's the key to understanding what happened. Maybe she's trying to warn us about something. Or maybe she's trapped and needs our help." Over the next few weeks, Mark and Sarah delved deeper into the mystery. They visited archives, interviewed anyone who might have information, and pieced together a timeline of strange occurrences and unexplained crashes. They discovered a pattern. Every 20 years, a flight would experience the same sequence of events, leading to a crash caused by these shadowy figures. Their research led them to a small town in Texas where they found an old, abandoned house once owned by a woman named Eliza Gray. Eliza had disappeared in 1965, the same year as the first documented crash involving the shadowy figures. Her disappearance had never been solved, and locals spoke of the house being haunted. Mark and Sarah stood before the dilapidated structure, its windows dark and foreboding. "This is it," Sarah whispered. "This is where it all started." They entered the house, the air thick with dust and the scent of decay. The floorboards creaked under their weight as they explored the rooms. In the attic, they found a trunk filled with old letters and photographs. One photograph caught Mark's eye, a portrait of Eliza Gray. It was the woman from his dreams, the same sad eyes staring back at him. As they sifted through the letters, they uncovered a chilling story. Eliza had been a pilot during World War II, flying in dangerous conditions and often encountering strange, shadowy figures in the skies. She believed these entities were spirits of lost soldiers, trapped between worlds. Her letters described how they followed her, how she felt their presence even on the ground. One letter stood out. In it, Eliza wrote about a stormy night when she saw the figures more clearly than ever. She believed they were trying to warn her of an impending disaster. Shortly after writing the letter, Eliza disappeared, and her plane was never found. Mark and Sarah realized that Eliza's spirit had been trying to communicate with them, to warn them about the shadowy figures and their connection to the crashes. They needed to find a way to release her and the other trapped souls. As they prepared to leave the house, the temperature dropped suddenly, and the air grew heavy. The shadowy figures began to materialize around them, their hollow eyes fixed on Mark and Sarah. They felt the oppressive weight of fear, but they stood their ground. "Eliza, if you can hear us, we're here to help!" Mark shouted into the darkness. "Tell us what we need to do." The figures paused, and the air seemed to crackle with energy. Eliza's ghostly form appeared before them, her eyes filled with sorrow and hope. She reached out, and in that moment, Mark and Sarah understood what needed to be done. They found an old, forgotten airstrip nearby, the same one Eliza had used. They gathered the remains of her letters and photographs, creating a makeshift memorial. As they set it alight, the shadowy figures began to dissipate, their forms unraveling in the glow of the flames. Eliza's spirit smiled, her form becoming more translucent until she finally vanished, leaving behind a sense of peace. The oppressive atmosphere lifted, and Mark and Sarah felt a weight lifted from their shoulders. The crashes stopped after that, and the shadowy figures were never seen again. Mark and Sarah returned to their lives, forever changed by their experience. They remained close friends, bound by the shared trauma and the knowledge that they had helped release trapped souls. In time, Mark's nightmares faded, replaced by dreams of Eliza's peaceful smile. He knew that while the world might never believe their story, they had done something extraordinary. They had faced the darkness and emerged victorious, ensuring that the skies remained safe from the shadowy figures that once haunted them.